month we have what we call political forum, and that's what we do. We talk, we complain, we listen, and we learn. So for the past months, however, COVID and get out the vote, as Sally said, have been our focus. So we've been a little bit slack on having meetings on policy. We have a lot of work and under great difficulty with COVID for getting out the vote. But tonight we're going back to policy issues, and I'm very happy about that. The policy issue for tonight is immigration policy. And we have Sarah Towle with us tonight, who's an expert in the subject. And I'm so happy, and I want to welcome her and tell you how happy, how pleased we are and honored to have Sarah speak to us tonight. So Sarah is actually a new member of the Democrats Abroad UK Women's Caucus leadership team. She is an international educator and an author of historical fiction and creative nonfiction multimedia properties, primarily for kids, until her current project, which she'll be speaking about later today. She's a mother and a consultant in social and emotional learning in educational environments. She found a passion for Central American history and culture in her college days during the Reagan's dirty wars, which sparked her interest and sparked her activism, actually. Throughout her 20s, Sarah worked as a volunteer literacy educator in areas of conflict in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. That was when she first bore witness to the US's troubled relationship with its southern neighbors. And when not in the Northern Triangle, she worked with refugees, what were then called New Americans, in New York City NGOs, community-based organizations, and community colleges. In her early 30s, she was recruited to teach at Nanjing University in China. She has been an economic migrant herself, mostly ever since. Like most Democrats, Sarah values diversity and embraces multiculturalism. She is an advocate for human rights and migrants' rights. She is a news junkie, as most of us are, and she prides herself on being informed. Yet, despite her background as a migrant and refugee advocate, she admits that she never truly understood the dehumanizing mechanism of the US immigration system until she went to the Texas-Mexico border in January 2020 to see for herself what was going on there and try to be, as she says, be of use. Her experience inspired her to write her current work in progress, which is entitled The First Solution, Tales of Humanity and Heroism from Trump's Manufactured Border Crisis, about many brave and selfless souls right now flying the tattered American flag values to bring dignity to the victims of the Trump administration's illegal and amoral immigration agenda. Sarah invites you to tweet about this workshop using her hashtags, Don't Look Away, Free Them All, and Witness at the Border. I will put those in the chat box. So now I pass the mic over to Sarah. Sarah, thank you again.
Thank you, Connie. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. And I should add that my Twitter handle is @HistoryTurnedOn if anybody wants to tweet. Welcome everybody to my talk on the humanitarian crisis unfolding on the southern border and in detention centers all over the country. I say the crisis is manufactured by Trump. The future president of the United States, Joe Biden, please, says it was created by Trump. On that point, the two of us agree. But what needs to be said is this. The Trump administration, which is the antagonist of my work in progress, whom I call Trump and Co., have leaned on laws and an infrastructure that preceded them and which sadly enabled them to twist their particular brand of inhumanity and amorality, to twist immigration in the US to cruel and potentially nefarious ends. It's the other side of the Black Lives Matter movement, a system with equally white nationalist motives and foundations that intersects with systemic racism at the prison industrial complex. My goals for today are to put a human face on Trump and Co.'s immigration agenda, to introduce you to some of the heroes and humanitarians trying to mitigate the worst of their multiple crimes against humanity, some of whom are on the call, to explain their multi-pronged immigration agenda with a series of D words, which weave together and will include denial of asylum, death of due process under the law, destruction of families, disappearance under a program called MPP, detention indefinitely in for-profit prisons, no matter your age, and deportations, like the Omni Air flight that repatriated 200 English-speaking Cameroonians to their death just yesterday, after being awarded $67 million from the COVID stimulus package under an airline bailout line item. Yes, it is that bad. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our hosts, Democrats Abroad France. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Sally. All of you should know that Sally is a guru on women's reproductive health and rights. So if you ever get a chance to hear her speak, you should. I'll speak hopefully about 30 minutes and leave enough time for Q&A, although we did get a late start, but know that if you're able to stay past the hour, so are we. So if you have a question, type it in the chat. They'll feed it to me. Sheila, Sally, and Connie will feed it to me. If we have to keep going after the hour, we can, because we got the Zoom room that long. So let's get started for reals. Let me share my screen here with my PowerPoint. Or in this case, it's make sure it works. Not working. Sorry, folks. I'm gonna have to do it manually. Zoom and keynotes aren't always happy bedfellows. All right, anyway, let me do that. Good. All right, so as Connie said, I never really truly understood the both of us tripped on that word.
Yeah.
The dehumanizing mechanics of the US immigration system until I went to the Tex-Mex border in January of this year. I went to see for myself and to be of use. For most of us, the immigration system exists out of view. Oh, I'm on the wrong screen. Exists out of view, out of sight, out of mind. Unless it touches us, we don't even know it's there. But that changed when Trump and Co. started publicly ripping babies out of the arms of terrified parents. That changed when we saw the images of kids in cages and heard their cries. That's when we all woke up. But it has to be said, the cages were there since the Carter administration. Families have been separated as far back as the first Bush administration. Deterrence was a Clinton era concept, as was mass incarceration. And Obama wasn't called the deporter in chief for nothing. Trump and Co.'s manufactured border crisis was built on all of that and more. But what makes their immigration agenda stand apart is the cruelty. Cruelty is their point. That and their express intent to kill the right to asylum in the US and to end due process under the law, both international and US law, all to deter people from coming, especially if you're poor and especially if you're Black and brown. Now, I was so tired of being outraged by the 2018 issues that I wanted to go to the border to be of use, but it took me almost 2 years to get there. And what I found while helping to feed people and make lists of clothing that were required was that my talents could, as a storyteller and an educator, could better be harnessed to chronicle not just the efforts of this administration to end asylum and curtail immigration, but to shine a light on the heroes and the humanitarians who are tirelessly bringing dignity to Trump and Co.'s victims. My hope is that in hearing their stories or reading their stories, you will be moved to act as well, whether that means serving dinner when you get to the border, donating to some of their efforts, or voting blue up and down the ballot this election season, which I'm sure you will. I am working to turn these tales into a book or a podcast or a visual series, but in the meantime, I'm publishing them as I write them in Medium because the issues they expose are just too urgent. So I'm going to add that URL into the chat, but I think I have to stop sharing to do that. So that if you are one of those people that likes to poke around while you're listening, you can do that while I talk, and I'll make reference to some of the good chapters as I go. Okay, so let's begin. Now, it all started, as we all recall, when Trump came down the escalator of Trump Tower announcing that all Mexican immigrants were rapists and criminals. It continued when he insisted that Mexico would build a big, beautiful wall. The icing on the cake, though, was inviting outed white nationalist Stephen Miller to be his immigration czar. And in early 2017, before the hardly attended inauguration was even over, the wheels of Miller's plan were set in motion. The first thing they did was to give Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, new marching orders to hunt down, detain, and deport undocumented immigrants. This resulted in what I call family separation 4.0, part of the destruction, the 6-part destruction of families that I write about in the chapter called Mary Tyler Moore and MPP. Obama did this too, but he targeted undocumented residents with criminal records. Trump targeted everyone. ICE raided homes, churches, elementary school, bus lines. They did so without warning. They did so without warrants. They targeted people who had been living and working and paying taxes and bringing up children in the US for decades. We're talking about parents of DACA recipients, people who might have come as refugees during the dirty wars, but never really became legal. Their point was to instill fear, to create terror among communities of undocumented immigrants in the hopes that they would just leave on their own. Then came the separation. Come on, thing. There we go. Then came the separation, the real separation of migrant families at the border, which finally made news in April 2018, but which quietly being piloted in El Paso for a year before that. As we know now, and as of just last week, everyone in the room where that decision happened put up their hand in agreement. But the world really didn't clock what was happening until April. I'm really having trouble with this. There we go. Until April of 2018, when Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced zero tolerance for illegal entry. By doing that, he criminalized immigration. Up to that point, it had a first time being caught, your first time coming over the border was a misdemeanor offense equal to jaywalking. But under US law, criminals cannot be trusted with their kids. So Trump and co. took them. And the idea was to deter others from coming. Look how mean we are. If you come, we'll take your kids. Of course, they weren't thinking that people who are fleeing persecution aren't going to stop and read in English what's happening in US news. They often don't even have time to pack. So more than 3,000 kids were taken in just that spring alone. And Trump and co. had no plan to put them back together again. Just taking the kids was the extent of their evil plan. So we needed people like Jody Goodwin to get them back with their parents again. That chapter is called Confronting the Cruelest Policy of All. What is the Northern Triangle? It's the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras that suffered the most during the dirty wars of the 60s through the 80s, that then kind of turned into the drug wars, and as a result, led to serious escalations of violence by organized crime. Police are now kind of one and the same with death squads, leading to the highest homicide rates in the world, staggering levels of domestic violence. So 90% of asylum seekers that arrive at the US border are from Northern Triangle countries. And when I say asylum seekers, I'm using the definition, the international definition of people who are seeking refuge elsewhere. Okay. There are several protections for asylum seekers in both international and US law. They're all here on the screen, but I'm going to draw your attention to the principle of non-refoulement, which means that signatories don't tend to send people back to places where they're likely to face torture, cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment, or punishment and other irreparable harm. Why I point that out is that it is the basis of US asylum law, at least before Trump and Co. If a person can demonstrate a credible fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a political group, like being a woman or LGBTQ, they cannot be subject to deportation until that asylum claim is processed. At least that's how it worked before Trump and Co. Before they showed up, what would happen is you'd show up, you'd ask for asylum, you would be taken through, or maybe you didn't ask for asylum. Everybody who interfaced with Customs and Border Protection were asked a series of questions, a credible fear interview, a finely crafted tool to tease out whether or not they had a credible fear of being sent home. And if they passed, they were they were sent to their sponsor in the United States. This is somebody who's agreed to take responsibility for you, to make sure you're clothed and you've got food and a roof over your head, and that you show up to your asylum hearings on time at the local jurisdiction. It's up to you to find a lawyer, and this didn't cost the U.S. taxpayer anything. Depending on the studies you look at, it worked 95 to 98% of the time, but of course, in his usual way, Trump and Co. said it didn't. And they called this process, they called the process catch and release. That wasn't new, but they determined to end it right out of the box. So going back to that infamous April 2018 with Jeff Sessions announcing zero tolerance, what we also didn't know when we were all protesting family separations was that he was back behind the scenes, probably with Stephen Miller, rewriting the definition of credible fear. He rolled back two asylum protections that were very, very important: domestic violence and gang violence. And that decision would affect nearly every asylum-seeking individual and family running from the Northern Triangle, where decades-long corruption and US-backed military training and support created these cultures of impunity. So 90% of arrivals, all from the Northern Triangle, came to Mexico, and instead of being open, let in with open arms, they were kicked back to Mexico under a new program. Well, not entirely new, but a program called metering. Basically, metering was like when you go to a gelateria in Italy and you've got to pay first and you get your number and then you wait in line. They had to take a number and wait in line to be processed, which created a backlog of humanity on the other side of the international boundary in Mexico. In the heat of the Texas summer, by doing this, people were still getting through, but they were getting through more slowly. Trump and Co. through CBP could control who was getting through when. And this is when you first saw humanitarians such as the Angry Tias and Abuelas and their love child, Team Brownsville, begin to come out and do their glorious thing. So I really urge you to read about them. Now, what happened to the other 10%? We're talking about people like the English-speaking Cameroonians, or my friend Stephen Tendo, Ugandan human rights and voting rights activist. They were largely jailed. So arguing that catch and release doesn't work, that it allows hardened criminals to get into the country under false pretenses, then disappear to do bad things, Trump and Co. resolved to keep asylum seekers not kicked back to Mexico in jail until their cases are adjudicated, even if they have sponsors waiting for them, which, for example, Stephen does. By obtaining so they'd have to stay in jail for the length of their case, their cases to go through. But it's very, very hard to find legal representation when you're in jail. You don't have a phone. It's very, very hard to access the outside world. So what Trump and Co. are really hoping by doing this is that it'll wind you, wear you down so hard that you'll just elect to self-deport. So as with extortionist deportations that rob from the CARES Act, indefinite detention of asylum seekers not only denies many innocent people due process under the law, but it also enables for-profit prison contractors to get rich off their misery. Indeed, 70% of ICE detention centers are run by private companies, including the richest, Geo Group and Core Civic. So make sure you're not stockholders in those companies. You can read more about who's profiting off the misery of asylum seekers in a chapter called Seeking Asylum in Trump's America, and in another one called Free Them, how one man with a bold sign and a commitment to witness spoke truth to power. We'll talk about Joshua Rubin again soon too. Okay, let's talk really quickly, quite quickly about Customs and Border Protection. Who are they? Customs and Border Protection are under the auspices of Homeland Security, which was created after 9/11 in a law and order, kind of hawkish response to terrorism. It includes Border Patrol, which wear the green outfits, ICE, who police the interior of the community of the country, while Border Patrol polices the perimeter, and something called the United States Customs and Immigration Service for folks who are already processed and on their way. DHS was given a bottomless pit of money to militarize the border in 2003, 4, 5, 6, throughout the Bush years. They added 17,000 agents within a blink of an eye with minimal training and inculcated them into a culture purely of law and order. As Stephen Tendo says, they treat us like we're terrorists. They have no humanitarian training. They are not themselves, they don't think of themselves as humanitarians. It was a myopic strategy with no accounting for massive global and hemispheric migration, and it just brings a proverbial hammer down on what is largely a humanitarian issue. And now we have the same officers patrolling the streets of Portland and DC and other cities where peaceful protesters are agitating against Trump and co. They have effectively been turned into his private police. You can read more about them in the education of a Border Patrol agent. So what does CBP do? Anybody who comes to the country, whether as an illegal immigrant or a legal immigrant, has to interface with CBP. So what happens? The first step, let's start with illegal. So if you're caught crossing the river, the Rio Grande, or you're caught crossing the Arizona desert, you're taken by CBP to a processing center. These are the infamous cages where the lights never turn off and the temperature is so cold that they say it's to combat germs and viruses, but it actually just makes everybody sick. They give you nothing but a little Mylar blanket to wrap yourself in, and you're supposed to be shoved out of there within 3 days, which is already too long. But under Trump and co, 100 people can be in the same cage for way too long. If you're with a kid, you have to prove under a Bush era anti-trafficking law that you are the kid's parent. It's not enough if you're the grandparent or the auntie. Those are not considered families in the US worldview. You must be the parent. If you cannot prove that you're the parent, the child will be taken away. So yes, family separations continue. They did not end on 20 June 2018. They just became more stealth. If you can prove your relationship with the child, then you're offered a Sophie's choice. Trump and Co tells you, you can be jailed with your child. There are 3 family detention centers, or you can let your child go and lose rights to your child and be jailed on your own. So this is what we're doing to traumatize people. If they stay together, they'll be in one of these 3 detention centers that were built under the Obama administration that were meant to be temporary processing centers, but they're being used by Trump and co as indefinite detention centers, and they just aren't built for it. But if your kid is taken away, it is then labeled an unaccompanied alien child, which I hate that name altogether. Even if they've arrived with a family member, they will be labeled unaccompanied and passed into another completely different bureaucracy that is shrouded in secrecy called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Now, fortunately, kids have rights that Trump and co have not been able to unseat almost. The main right protecting them is called the Flores Settlement Agreement, which was finally negotiated after 13 or 15 years of being passed around in the US court system at the Supreme Court level, finally, in 1997. And what it says is that children must be let out, must be released no more than 20 days. 5 days is optimum because we know every additional day that a child is jailed apart from a loved one, more mental health damage is done. Trump and co don't seem to care much about that. But when they are released, they should be released first to a family member if one can be found, if not another relative, if not another relative, a sponsor, if not a sponsor, a foster family, if not a foster family, a shelter licensed to take care of kids. You can read more about the history of the Flores Settlement Agreement in the chapter called Mary Tyler Moore and MPP. Now, Trump and co hate the FSA, and they also tried to dismantle it without success in the summer of 2018, which was a very, very busy year. They couldn't get around the law, so they hacked a workaround. And what they did is they built two of the biggest temporary incarceration centers ever known to the US, one in Tornillo in the Texas desert, and one in Homestead, Florida, on an old military base. And basically they said that as these are federal lands, they're not subject to laws and agreements. So they warehoused kids there. In both cases, the population swelled to about 1,500, teenagers mostly, and they used the kids as bait by subjecting their potential sponsors, not just their sponsor, but to everybody in a sponsor's household, to background checks. They were able to find more undocumented residents. They passed the information to ICE, who raided the houses, cleared them out. So what happened? Sponsors stopped agreeing to checks, which got kids stuck in these shelters, languishing sometimes for months. It must also be said that there was a huge profit motive for keeping kids incarcerated. Homestead, for example, on whose board sits General John Kelly, you remember him, first Secretary of Homeland Security under Trump, and the first member of Trump and co to go on the record in 2017 saying that the administration was considering separating families. That Homestead charged the US taxpayer $775 per day per child. So there's a lot of people making money off this immigration agenda. Now, what if you arrive and you're legal? You're an asylum seeker and you say, hey, I am being persecuted at home and I want safe refuge in the United States. Well, first you'll be taken to the same cages, the same processing centers and processed. And then, as I said before, you'll either be passed to ICE, who will detain you because they no longer believe that you're going to show up for your asylum hearings, or you will be disappeared into Mexico. Now let's go back to that. In June of 2018, as I said, Trump and co started implementing this system called metering, which was go back to Mexico, take a ticket, wait in line, and await your turn to be processed. So people were still getting through, sometimes in trickles, sometimes in huge numbers, depending on the whims of CBP and Trump and co, throughout the fall, or throughout the rest of that year. But by January 2019, metering had evolved into something called the Migrant Protection Protocol. And I put protection in quotes. Oops, I've lost my screen. There it is. I put protection in quotes because it doesn't protect anybody at all. It's a complete misnomer. There's no government helping these people. There's no international NGO providing any protection at all. Not US, not Mexico. UNHCR is sort of there, but quite secretly. So it was really up to the people right there on the ground with the great big beating hearts, like the Angry Tias and like Team Brownsville, who I've already mentioned, like Charlene de Cruz and Lawyers for Good Government, and Sister Norma and many others who I haven't written about yet. It was really up to them to help these people. So these are the heroes and the humanitarians that stepped up to bring dignity and justice to Trump and Co.'s victims, and who eventually formed into something called the Dignity Village Collaborative, who inspired me to write this book. Okay, so the thing about, so what is MPP? Let's just go right to that. MPP, I'm going to show you what MPP is while I talk. Here are some pictures from my time there in January. It started, as I said, in San Diego, and it took a while to arrive in Brownsville because before it could be implemented, they needed this, this series of big top tents, which look like circus tents. And it's a circus. It's a kangaroo court. It's a Kafkaesque and Orwellian environment all rolled up into one, where very, very few asylum seekers have legal representation, where they're subject to at least 5 hearings that take place over 8 to 10 months. And that was before the border closed, where they meet their judges like this on a screen. And the judges are DOG appointees. They're not even necessarily, bar appointed, bar affiliated judges. And they're subject to very, very, very strict quotas. Asylum seekers stuck in Mexico under MPP are made to feel that there is a hope that one day they will be led into the United States. But the truth of the matter is 11 out of 10,000 were successful last year in 2019 in getting through. So that's 0.1% actually were successful in having their asylum claims granted. You can read more about that in the chapter called Unlikely Witness to Trump's Court. So they stay nearby. This is a picture of the Matamoros refugee camp when I was there in January. There were about 2,500 asylum-seeking families living in tents and in shelters all throughout, all hugged up right up by the border. They need to be close, so when it's their time for a hearing, they can get across the border into the courts. So they're living in these tents and in these shelters in one of the most dangerous places on earth, where they're subject to the same threats they ran from the cartel. They're preyed upon by the cartels. They're in danger of extortion, robbery, kidnapping, rape, murder. They're living in tents in all kinds of weather, in the heat, in the rain. They're battling cold and snakes and mosquitoes and hurricanes. If it weren't for Team Brownsville, they'd have no food. If it weren't for the Angry Tias, they'd have no clothes and tents. If it weren't for global response management, they'd have no medical care. If it weren't for Resource Center Matamoros, they'd have no toilets and no hand washing stations. And if not for Jody Goodwin and Lawyers for Good Government, they'd have no legal aid to help them with their asylum claims. So in effect, this is Trump's true wall. It's not physical. It's a bureaucratic border built specifically to keep asylum seekers out, while on the US side, they work the courts or work the legal system to kill asylum in violation of international law, and where the majority of Americans don't know they're there. So they've effectively, in 2019, through MPP, Trump and Co. disappeared 60,000 people that most of us don't know are there. The humanitarians on the border do, and they're helping them as best they can. But the rest of the country, when Mark Meadows says, oh, our numbers are down, they go, yay, and not realizing that there are people in serious danger languishing on the other side of the border. So this is where things stood when I arrived in Matamoros in Brownsville in January of 2020. I intended to bear witness for a little while and then go hike in Big Bend with my husband. But when we were confronted with this humanitarian crisis, which was bigger than anything we could have imagined, we decided to stay for the duration of our holiday and witness what was going on and interview people and document with photographs and maybe write a few articles. The day we left, the deportations began. While most Americans were beginning to clock that a global pandemic was on its way, in fact, Wuhan was locked down while we were in Brownsville, Trump and co were busy arm twisting third safe country agreements out of all nations to the south. A third safe country agreement states, if you have not stopped in the first country into which you pass and asked for asylum and been denied, then you are not eligible for asylum in the United States, which is completely ridiculous because if you're in Honduras and you're running from MS-13, you're not going to get away from MS-13 in Guatemala. They exist there too. The cartels don't have national boundaries. So this was just another way for Trump and co to mess with due process under international law. And then, as if that weren't bad enough, Stephen Miller's greatest wet dream came true. COVID. COVID closed the border once and for all. Decrying it as a hoax everywhere else, they used the coronavirus in the name of public health to finally close the border. They did so in March, which unfortunately shut out a lot of the humanitarians that live on the Brownsville side and could no longer get across, trapped victims of MPP in the most dangerous place on earth, trapped detainees in ICE prisons. ICE does have the discretion to let them out, but it won't. Trapped kids in ORR kids shelters, of which there are, by my count, about 147 in the United States. New arrivals that have arrived since the border closed, which are about 150,000 at this point. Many of them, if not kicked back into Mexico, were secreted into Hilton hotels and held there without any legal representation, even little kids, and then quickly deported back to where they came from, possibly to their deaths. Deportations are costing the US taxpayer anywhere from $11,000 to $35,000 per detainee. And the same planes are being used to transport Border Patrol SWAT teams to blue cities. There's no testing or tracking of any kind, just temperature taking, meaning that Trump and co, after screaming that migrants and asylum seekers were bringing diseases into our country, are themselves likely spreading coronavirus throughout the developing world. More recently, and I'm almost done, they have frozen green card applications, barred most categories of family and employment-based immigration. They're taxing asylum applicants now. They've implemented a wealth test, both of those measures to create more barriers to poor migrants. They've slowed processing of hundreds of thousands of potential 2020 voters, and they've curbed temporary protective status. Trump and co have remade the US immigration system by end-running Congress and largely sidestepping the courts. Through more than 400 executive actions, they have sealed off the US border and slashed legal immigration. They've leveraged a sprawling, dysfunctional post-9/11 security infrastructure to achieve an immigration agenda built on racist and dehumanizing motivations. They've created an invisible wall by limiting foreign aid in Central America to nothing more than enforcement, thereby transforming Mexican and Guatemalan forces into henchmen for the US. Just last week, hundreds of members of a new migrant caravan originating in Honduras were rounded up and deported before they even made it into Mexico and into the US news cycle. Trump and co have left an enormous bureaucratic tangle for a Biden administration to undo, with now a backlogged immigration court system since it's been suspended since May, even though migration has continued. Plus, Biden has the Obama legacy to wriggle out from under, which he's already qualified is a big mistake. So to conclude, and I'm sorry I've gone over time, the humanitarian crisis manufactured by Trump and co impacts us all. It calls into question American values. It negates the symbolism attached to the Statue of Liberty. Trump may be the first president to openly turn his back on the American myth of our being a land of immigrants. And when we are able to stop and finally breathe and count up all the lives that this administration has destroyed and all the deaths that they've created, we'll be called upon to decide, is this simply just another shameful period in our nation's history? Or has this multi-pronged approach resulted in multiple crimes against humanity? Or have Trump and co committed a quiet genocide with our tax dollars and in our name? Time will tell. I'm still trying to figure that out. So that's the end of my talk. I'm just going to pop into the chat here the URLs of all the organizations that I'm writing about on the border in the event you want to donate to their lovely causes. Got the Angry Tias and Team Brownsville and a bunch of others in there. So you can get to know them better, get to know them more. And I've also included their kind of remit in the event that you're more drawn to medical support versus getting porta potties. Anyway, that's me done.
Thank you, Sarah. Brilliant, as usual, I must say. It's hard to get enthusiastic about such a dire story, but you told it very well and continue to tell it very well.
Thank
I
you.
think it's really important that you're speaking out. And I think now we will turn this over to our participants. I think the first question will come from Sheila, who has a very interesting question. I think it's, it's very political, all of this, and as we all know, and as we listen to what's going on in the United States, listen and watch at a distance, because you were very brave to have gone there, except for our one or two people, Joyce, who's in Texas. Sheila, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Sarah. It was so moving and so important and such a learning experience, because I had no idea about all of the figures that you gave us and the horrors that I read about in your newspaper medium or blog. My question is very political. What is Biden and Harris's platform about immigration? And could you tell us that in comparison with Obama's, for example?
Okay, sure. I will try to do that. And thank you, Sheila, for your lovely comments. Yes, Biden, in a nutshell, Biden and Harris, he's already on record saying he'll end MPP. We've got it in video, so we're going to hold him to it. Of course, that's not going to be easy because it could create a rush at the border. So it's going to be tricky. But he says in his first 100 days that he will end MPP. He will do everything he can to prioritize remaining family reunifications, because there really are still a lot of families that are separated. He will reinstate DACA and create a new program called DAPA, which is Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. He'll rescind the Muslim ban once and for all. He'll end Trump's national emergency declaration, which has rerouted billions of federal funds to the border wall, although I think it's actually going to pay Mexico and Guatemalan enforcement. And then in addition to that, after the first 100 days, he and Harris have agreed to champion immigration reform once and for all, which is really, really important because immigration is not codified in the Constitution. It was left up to Congress to decide. So as a result, it's battered back and forth with the political winds. And that's why it's built on this kind of Rube Goldberg foundation, right? It's not really a broken system, because broken suggests it ever worked, and it never did. So we're hoping that they will take steps to actually codify a system and get rid of the for-profit detention centers, which going to Obama agreed to do. Obama was on track to dismantle the for-profit detention center industry. Core Civic and Geo Group became major contributors to the Trump campaign, dumped a ton of money in, and they have just recently both been awarded new 10-year contracts. So I'm not sure how a Biden administration is going to be able to undo that. In addition, they are fast tracking citizenship for farm workers. They're going to increase H-1B visas, which is good. And they're raising Biden has said he will raise the cap on refugee admissions from 85,000, which was Obama's highest number, to 125,000, which will be the highest ever in the history of the US. In contrast, this year is 18, and we'll be lucky if 3,000 asylum seekers are successful. There's a bunch more that he'll do, diverting funds and all of that. But in contrast to Obama, that's a tough one because I know we all love Obama. But his biggest mistake was trusting the Republicans to be nice, to play nice and compromise. He thought he could win their favor in his first term by cracking down on illegal immigration and deporting immigrants in order to save DACA kids. So that was his gamble, his gambit. I want to save DACA, so I'll let the Republicans have their deportations. We all know now that it was a big mistake, and he is the first to admit it. So he also, I must say, the surge that his administration was forced to deal with, that was unprecedented. That was almost 70,000 kids without parents and another 70,000 family units. I mean, mind-boggling, right? So a lot of what they did, which was unfortunately to expand ORR kids shelters and expand these processing detention centers, that happened under Obama, but it happened in response to the fact that there were 140,000 people suddenly showing up on our doors.
Thank you. Wonderful answer.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe Connie had a question that she wanted to ask as well.
I was curious about Obama too, but actually you've answered most of the questions that I had. I understand the conundrum that he had before him, but what is going to make it better for Biden? I mean, it's even worse today than it was for Obama.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I noticed that the Trump administration, during that big immigrant time when we used to talk about immigration and the borders in the news, Trump never missed an occasion, and nor did Jeff Sessions, to say that Obama started this. So of course they were shifting the blame, because indeed this did exist under Obama. But how the Democrats would have to control the House, the Senate, and the presidency in order to do. Where did they start? I'd love to hear what you just said about some of the campaign promises of Harris and Biden. And they're going to need an awful lot of power and votes and control of the government in order to be able to do this.
100%.
It's such a sad story, Sarah. You've told it so well. Okay. I mean, it moved you to tears. I had met people who had been there and said it was so heartbreaking they could barely bear it, lawyers who went there to help people. And it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is unbelievable that this has happened in our lifetime. And I agree with you. It's going to take a lot of work to fix, and it's going to take a lot more than 4 years. So one thing we have to do is get a Democratic majority and then hold on to it. But a lot of it was done by executive action. So, so they'll be able to undo much of it without having to take it to the floor, right?
That's good news.
Yeah, that is good news. The other thing is, and I think that this is really important, that Biden has also said that he will work, and I don't know how he's going to do it, honestly, because the mess that we made as a nation with really bad foreign policy going back years, the mess that we have created in the Central American region, it feels intractable. But Biden has said that he will divert funds that have been used to prop up the militarization of DHS to what's the word I'm looking for? To grow international partnerships in Latin America aimed at reducing poverty, insecurity, and violence, targeting corruption. And he'll want to do that by investing in civil society organizations that allocate resources for concrete reform from the ground up. But it will take time. I mean, as many decades as it took to create this mess, it's going to take to fix it. Does that
Well,
help?
Yeah.
Similar to what's going on in Europe, for that matter.
Oh, completely parallel issues.
Yeah.
Greece is our Mexico,
Right.
right? So that's the next book that I'm going to write.
Yeah.
I think Carol Moore has some interesting comments, and maybe you mean these as questions or comments, Carol.
Yeah, just Carol, you
No,
want
no, I was just, Sarah picked up on it. Sarah, I wrote in the chat box that Trump couldn't get any of this through Congress, even in his early days. And it was, as you said, done by executive action. And you know, running these agencies, which is the administrative side of the executive power. You know, I am hoping he's going to have his transition team ready to go November 3rd to have stuff to be on the desk January 20th, you know, to really start and get the people in place to keep, you know, addressing the horror story you've just shared with us. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Oh, you're welcome, Carol.
It's fantastic to get the detail, get the history, and, you know, to know, God willing, it can change in 3 weeks' time.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen.
Start to change. Start to change.
I think one of the more interesting things, and I don't know, maybe Sarah, you can fill us in on this, whether or not the change in the US definition of refugee status was done by executive order, because it is blatantly in conflict with all the international treaties and UN norms. And at some point, when we do control Congress and the White House, somebody has got to fix that, because the legal situation with regard to domestic violence, I mean, what you pointed out is completely illegal internationally. So was that done by executive order? I hope so, because then it can be undone.
Yeah, that can be undone too. Biden has also said on his plank that he will restore those two protections that I said were yanked, domestic violence and gang violence. That's part of a legal matter called Matter of AB. And so it is written into our law. So I think that Sessions yanking that was actually an illegal action, and it's been.
I mean, clearly, it's just that somebody's got to do something about it. And
Well,
in today's.
I'm sure the ACLU is already working on reversing that, but I'm pretty sure that one can be, you know, just retwigged. The international laws not only do, and immigration isn't the only matter in which the United States falls short in terms of international law, but the international laws are there, and we are signatory to those conventions.
Absolutely. I think Michelle Brothers has a question. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hello. I can't find my image, but I'm here somewhere. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's okay. That's what counts. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much to the Women's Caucus. I really appreciate all the meetings. I'll start with a comment, if you don't mind. I wish I could say I'm shocked. I'm completely not shocked, because very unfortunately, I've had the experience of being at the border myself with my organization, Doctors for Global Health. We were there, we had our annual meeting in Tucson, and we spent a day in Dos Nogales. We went to the wall, of course, the gate. We went to the fake court. And the people that I participate with, I'm on the board, and I'm also the European liaison of this organization, are basically medical people, but they cooperate in many different ways. We have projects in El Salvador, where I've been several times, and Mexico. So I completely support and bear witness to your comments. I'd like to know how I can reach you. I don't tweet.
Okay,
So
sure.
is there, no, really, is there a way that via email or
Yeah.
we can be in touch. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the work we do.
Yeah.
It's completely virtual and professional, and we totally support the work you're doing. And thank you all. That was my question and comment.
I'll thank you very much for your witness and your service. And I'll pop my email in the chat, but you can also get in touch with me through the Medium magazine if you want to poke around and look at some of my articles. I'm pretty sure there's a way to DM me through that. So here you go.
And may I add, Sarah?
Yeah.
I think you should put that in the chat box again.
Okay.
Because Medium, the link is extraordinary. The stories are extraordinary. You can't believe such heroes exist in the middle of a crisis like this, and it must be so hopeless. But there are people there whose stories are incredible.
Can I just say that we have some of those incredible people right here on the call? If they have,
yeah.
Joyce, Susan, and Cindy, will you unmute and we wave to everybody? These are 3 of the now 9 Angry Tias y Abuelas, and they are my heroes.
I think we should be clapping for them.
Welcome, welcome, and thank you for joining us. If you'd like to say something, please feel free.
Please do. Please.
I'll real quickly. One that I think is really critical for everyone to know is something that's happening right this moment. There's a lot happening right this moment, but close to 200 Cameroonian detainees, and I think Sarah mentioned them early on, were flown out of a Texas facility yesterday, and that plane arrived at its first stopping point in, I believe, West Africa a couple of hours ago. And we were informed that the military was awaiting them. So what you have there are people who have never committed a crime, who requested asylum, who requested asylum because their lives were in danger in most cases in the countries they had left. And some of them have been in detention for as long as 2 years. And they were essentially just all rounded up and brought to the same detention facility we can see now for the purpose of being deported back to the countries that they fled because of fear of death. And so rather than being greeted by safe and welcoming family members or people who could take them into security and safety, it appears they're probably being greeted by the military. And so I just think that everybody needs to know, on top of everything that our nation has been doing to asylum seekers over the last couple of years or so, this is probably I don't want to use the term icing on the cake, but I mean, this is like the worst of it all that we're seeing happening right now. And it's another out of sight, out of mind for the American public. They don't see the 60,000 people who are desperate and giving up and with their children in the camps and the shelters in northern Mexico. And they don't see these Cameroonian and other African immigrants being shipped right back to where they came from to danger. So I just, think that we need to really make it, we need to spread that word. We need to make sure people know, because, if there are people who are undecided in the election right now, who have half of a heart and any level of decency left within them, they need to be aware that they need to vote for Biden and not Trump, because with Trump, there will be even more horror. And that's what we've experienced here on the border for the last 2.5 years, is just increasingly worse horror stories. It's not gotten better, it's gotten worse. So I mean, it's not, happy news there at all, but it's truth, and thank you, Sarah, so much for, for using your talent, your investigative journalistic talent to build a story for the public.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I know we were working tirelessly all last week, calling congressional members and Amnesty and petitioning and everything to try to save the Cameroonians. And I went to bed last night just feeling like I wanted to give up. It's so easy in this work to want to
It
give
is.
up, but we just can't give up. And so I wonder on this end if there's anything we can do for them at this point, now that they've actually been left our shores.
I wish I knew the answer to that. You know, maybe Susan, I know Madeline is the one who's following this most closely. There's a close relationship with one of those detainees. And it's quite heartbreaking, you know, to really to see that person go into danger. United Nations, Amnesty International, you know, whoever, if the military in fact closed down that airport and arrived there to receive those people, I don't know what anyone else can do.
Well, there's, if I may say so, did you say that they were deported to Cameroon? Cameroon has a very active civil society, and Amnesty is there. There are a lot of human rights groups that are there. So if you wanted a heads up, merely alerting them to the arrival of the plane would be sufficient.
I think that's been happening. I mean,
Yeah,
it's been
sure it is.
pretty mobilized, but I think the military is pretty strong too. So yeah, I mean, Cameroonian Council has been on top of this from the beginning, and they're a little discouraged at what's happening at the moment. But you know, we can't give up, and anything that anyone knows that will help to bring people to help them, we have to do. So thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you, Joyce.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions?
I do. It's me again, sorry.
We're going to close this down in a bit, but go ahead. Connie.
And my question isn't exactly about what you do. And my question is, in fact, very basely electoral. Why in the United States would so many Hispanic communities and populations, formerly immigrants or refugees even, be supporting Donald Trump? What language is he speaking to them?
That is such a complicated issue.
Yeah.
And I am scared to touch it. Cindy, do you want to try?
Or Susan, Cindy or Susan.
You've got to unmute, sweetie.
Oh,
I think Susan could answer that. I really, really don't have a clue why they would support him. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Mind-boggling.
there is a tendency for people who are inside to want to keep themselves inside and keep others out. That's a human nature that happens all over the world. But Susan, if you want to speak, I'm trying to unmute you. There you go. Susan? Oh,
Unmute.
There she goes.
yeah.
Okay. I have no answer for that either. There are people, Hispanic people, who are very conservative, and some of the things that Trump does and says, they're in favor of. So I can't explain it. That's all I can explain.
I mean, I can only say that I recognize my own internal bias when I went to my first detention center while I was there in Texas. And I was shocked that my unconscious expectation was that all the guards would be fat white men. They were not. They were largely Hispanic. They looked just like the people they were guarding. And I find that very complicated. And I haven't quite figured out how to talk about it as a privileged white woman.
Well, it's because it's a very good job here in this area. I mean, this is a very high poverty area, and
Yeah.
that is an excellent job. So there are a lot of people who will go work for a government agency, even that one, because it's a job.
Yeah, yeah. And it becomes normalized and they're just doing their job. We saw that in Immigration Nation. I think it's probably true of the people who are deporting the Cameroonians. They're just putting on their masks and doing their job and getting paid and not thinking about the repercussions, maybe.
I don't want to dwell on it, but this is a very deeply philosophical question where the victim becomes the abuser.
Well,
And,
this is it is a human thing that's been going on in all conflict areas all over the world for the last 200 years. Sheila indicated she wanted to ask a question.
Not a
So,
question. In fact, Connie just said it. There
Oh.
are so many cases and situations where people vote against their own interests. It happens in every society and in almost every situation. And it's true that it's often with people who are poor and uneducated, but we see it in lots of places. People in America who who are voting for Trump in West Virginia, for example, because they think that there will be a coal industry again, and against all evidence, there will not be. So I don't want to belabor it, but it's unfortunately something that we see in many places. And Connie said also where the victim, where there's a victimization of it. So I'll stop there because I think we're ending.
Thank you, Sheila. Next conf call will be on why victims become abusers. How about that? And I think we could include a lot of domestic violence in that discussion.
Yeah.
I would like to thank all of you, Sarah in particular, for sharing all of her knowledge and the good work that you're doing and all the support that we can probably, hopefully give you. Just yell. Thanks again, all of you, for attending this way too short, but we need to get on with other things here. And if any of you want to contact Sarah, she has put her email in the chat box. And please don't forget to vote, okay? And if you have any questions and need help, Democrats Abroad are here for you. So don't be shy. And we're with you, Sarah. We're all with you.
Thank you so much for making this happen. I'm really grateful for all the asylum seekers and detainees out there that need to know we're behind them. Thank you.
Absolutely. And have a good evening wherever you are, or a good morning to Joyce in Texas. Take care, everyone.
And Sarah, be sure to meet Michelle Brothers.
Oh, yes.
I won't go into our past together, but
Okay.
Bye.
you are
Bye,
made
everyone.
for each
Thank
other.
you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.